James Harper is a 35-year-old white police officer, standing tall at 6 feet 2 inches, with a fit physique that reflects years of discipline in both his career and personal life. His sharp, angular features and ice blue eyes often intimidate those around him. Confident in his uniform, he moves through the world with an air of authority. To most, he appears self-assured, even arrogant. Harper prides himself on his role as an officer, believing that the badge he wears carries not just power, but also a moral righteousness. He sees his job as a duty to uphold order, even if the order sometimes feels like it's stacked in his favor. Beneath this polished exterior, however, lies an insecurity he keeps buried deep within. Harper grew up in a working-class neighborhood, where his family struggled to make ends meet. His rise to a position of authority within the police force is a source of pride, but it also serves as a constant reminder that his self-worth is tied to his job. He often feels like he has to prove his value, and this need to assert dominance in his role sometimes turns into a subtle defensiveness when confronted with challenges to his authority, particularly from the communities he patrols. Harper's day begins early, before the sun has even risen. He laces up his sneakers and goes for a jog through the quiet streets of the city. His run is a time for him to center himself, to prepare mentally for the demands of the day. As the city slowly comes to life, Harper's mind starts focusing on his work, patrolling, keeping order, ensuring that the status quo is maintained. He holds firmly to the belief that his role is vital, that it maintains the peace, even if the peace feels fragile at times. At the precinct, his morning briefing is a ritual. He exchanges brief pleasantries with his colleagues, but he keeps conversations professional, never letting anyone in on his deeper thoughts or feelings. He's never been one to open up, preferring to keep personal matters strictly out of view. His colleagues respect him for his unwavering commitment to the job, but there's always an undercurrent of tension, as if they too sense the emotional distance he maintains. Each day, he's assigned patrol routes in various parts of the city. Harper is used to navigating the socio-political minefield of the urban streets, but it's never easy. The city is divided, with the wealthier white areas and poorer black neighborhoods coexisting side by side, each with its own set of rules. Harper's interactions with people often feel transactional, distant, and, at times, tense. He believes in the law, but struggles to connect with the people he serves. The city itself is a place of stark contrasts. On one side, the polished, affluent neighborhoods, with their wide streets and well-kept homes, appear orderly and secure. On the other, the rundown areas where the black community resides, filled with crumbling buildings and overcrowded blocks, exude a sense of constant struggle. There's an undeniable tension in the air, a simmering undercurrent that only occasionally breaks the surface, but is always palpable. Harper's precinct lies on the border between these two worlds, a symbolic microcosm of the city's racial divide. Inside, the officers adhere to the traditional hierarchy of power. There are whispered conversations about the neighborhoods they patrol, the people they encounter. While Harper doesn't see it this way, there is a distinct division between the officers who patrol the white areas and those who work the black communities. The precinct's halls are filled with plaques honoring past victories, but there's an unspoken awareness of the systemic inequalities that persist, even as the precinct leadership turns a blind eye to them. Outside, the city streets pulse with life, but the disparity between the two sides is glaring. In the wealthier areas, the sidewalks are clean, and people walk by with their heads held high. In contrast, the black neighborhoods are filled with kids playing in the streets, women chatting on porches, and the constant noise of life. But it's often overshadowed by the occasional siren and the unspoken fear of police presence. People here know the drill, play it safe, don't challenge authority, and try to survive the best they can. Harper, though, doesn't always see it that way. To him, the divisions are clear-cut, order versus chaos, law versus lawlessness, and his role as a cop is to maintain that line. As Harper's patrol car rolls through the streets, the tensions between the two worlds become evident. The glances he receives from the residents in the black neighborhoods are often wary, even hostile. Harper can feel the subtle shift when he pulls up to a corner or a convenience store. People cross the street, their eyes lingering on him for just a moment too long. He tells himself it's all part of the job. The unspoken acknowledgement that the people here don't trust the badge, don't trust the system. He doesn't let it bother him, but deep down a voice nags at him. The unease is starting to get under his skin. He's used to commanding respect, but in these areas, respect feels like a game of cat and mouse, a negotiation he's not entirely sure he understands. The conversations he overhears in the precinct about racial justice, police brutality, and community relations only add to the growing discomfort he feels. As he chalks it up to the noise of an increasingly divided society, there's a nagging doubt that he can't shake. What if the system isn't as infallible as he thought? What if, in his quest to enforce order, he's become part of the problem? It was a Tuesday morning when James Harper spotted the car, a sleek black sedan weaving through the streets, slightly speeding in an area known for its mixed traffic. With his training and experience, Harper knew it wasn't an uncommon sight in these parts of the city. His fingers twitched toward the siren as he began the routine maneuver to pull the car over, the flashing lights cutting through the morning haze. The driver, Marcus Wright, didn't flinch when Harper approached the window. A 30-year-old black man, tall with a calm demeanor that seemed to contrast sharply with Harper's tension. Marcus's expression didn't betray fear, but it wasn't warm either. Harper approached the window with his usual air of authority. He asked for Marcus's license and registration with a curt tone, scanning the interior of the car as if expecting to find something. It was a routine traffic stop, something Harper had done hundreds of times. But as the seconds passed, Harper's discomfort began to grow. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Marcus was looking at him with judgment, a quiet defiance in his eyes. Harper's grip tightened on his pen. He began to ask more invasive questions, his voice rising with unnecessary aggression. "Where are you headed? You know the speed limit here, right?" he demanded, his words sharp. Marcus tried to remain calm, responding politely, explaining he was simply on his way to a community meeting. But Harper wasn't listening anymore. His assumptions about Marcus, shaped by his own biases, fed into a simmering rage. He was a cop, and this man was just another black man testing the system. "I don't want to hear excuses," Harper snapped. "You've got a history, don't you? I can already tell your trouble." His words were laced with contempt. What Harper didn't know, however, was that Marcus was well known in the community. He wasn't just any citizen. He was a prominent advocate for local change, a respected leader working toward a position in local government. The racial bias seeping into Harper's words wasn't lost on Marcus, but he refused to rise to the bait, maintaining composure even as his heart began to race. With a final sneer, Harper handed Marcus his ticket and dismissed him with a sharp, "Get out of here." Harper watched as Marcus drove away, the confrontation already fading from his mind. He chuckled to himself, reassured by the thought that he'd just dealt with another one of them, the people who didn't understand authority. His thoughts spiraled into justification. He wasn't respecting the law. He needed to be reminded of his place, he told himself, his jaw tight as he walked back to his squad car. As he slid into the driver's seat, Harper's thoughts were filled with a sense of superiority. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. After all, he was upholding the law, maintaining order, doing his job. In his worldview, Marcus's attitude had been defiant, an act of rebellion, but Harper had crushed it. He was the one who held the power, and that made him right. He ran a mental checklist, trying to remember the finer points of the exchange, but dismissed the interaction as nothing more than a minor speed bump in his day. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered to himself. But as he drove off, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The confrontation felt oddly out of place, and despite the self-assuredness in his thoughts, he couldn't shake the sense that Marcus hadn't been just another ordinary person. He was different. Harper couldn't quite put his finger on it, But the knowledge that Marcus had not flinched or submitted to his power stirred an unease within him. Still, Harper pushed it away. He was in control, he was the authority here, and that was what mattered. As the day wore on, Harper continued with his patrols, but the earlier encounter lingered in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. He dismissed it as just another instance of resistance he had to deal with, nothing more, nothing less. Yet, something in the back of his mind refused to let it go. Every time he pulled over another driver or spoke with a resident, he was hyper-aware of his actions, as if the weight of the day's events was quietly coloring his judgments. Back at the precinct, the usual chatter and banter felt distant. Harper's colleagues went about their business, discussing the latest cases and sharing mundane anecdotes, but Harper felt disconnected from them. He hadn't been able to fully shake the feeling that his role in the community had started to feel more complicated. What had started as routine had been disrupted, first by Marcus's defiance, and then by the strange aftertaste the interaction left. As Harper sat in the locker room, absent-mindedly pulling off his uniform, his mind wandered to the faces of people he'd encountered earlier in the day, especially Marcus. The man's calm composure, the lack of fear, the absence of submission to his authority. It bothered him in a way that he couldn't understand. For the first time in a long while, Harper found himself questioning the reasons he had joined the force, questioning whether his role was as justified as he had always believed. The once clear line between order and disorder, right and wrong, seemed more blurred than ever. Marcus wasn't just another person who didn't respect him. He was a reminder that the power Harper wielded was not absolute. The thought lingered with him as he headed home that evening, unsettled in a way he couldn't shake. The day after the traffic stop, the video surfaced. Someone had captured the confrontation on their phone, and within hours it went viral. The footage was damning, painting Harper as an arrogant and aggressive officer whose racial bias was all too apparent. The video's widespread circulation set off a firestorm of public outrage. News outlets and social media platforms erupted, with people condemning Harper's behavior, accusing him of racial profiling, and demanding accountability. At the precinct, the tension was palpable. The air felt thick with judgment as Harper walked through the halls. Whispers followed him, eyes averted when he passed. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. His colleagues, who had once shared easy jokes with him, now looked at him differently. Some didn't know what to say, but others were quick to offer a few words of support. "Don't worry, James," one officer said, clapping him on the back. "This will blow over. People just like to cause a scene." But it didn't blow over. Marcus's supporters were vocal, and the video had opened up old wounds in the community. What had been simmering beneath the surface for years now boiled over. The media coverage didn't help. Reporters painted Harper as the embodiment of a broken system, and public pressure mounted. Soon, calls for a formal investigation began, with many pushing for Harper's suspension or even termination. Despite the mounting scrutiny, Harper remained defiant, believing that the backlash would eventually dissipate. After all, he reasoned, he had done his job. But deep inside, he could feel the walls closing in, as if the very foundation of his confidence was beginning to crack. The precinct, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like an oppressive reminder of his missteps. And worst of all, he knew that the story had only just begun. Marcus's growing presence in the media meant that the battle was far from over. As the media storm continued, new faces began to emerge in the narrative. On Marcus's side, there was Elijah Carter, a seasoned community leader who had mentored Marcus for years. Elijah had been a voice of reason in the community, advocating for peaceful change and for Black voices to be heard in local politics. His presence had always commanded respect, but now it carried even more weight, especially as Marcus's political aspirations began to gain serious traction. Elijah was outspoken, calling for justice for Marcus and speaking out against the systemic issues that led to incidents like the one with Harper. He was the face of the community's fight for equality and fairness. At the precinct, Harper's colleagues were split. Officer Lisa Jenkins, who had always been quiet about her own beliefs, found herself increasingly uncomfortable with Harper's actions. She had always kept a professional distance from Harper, but now she couldn't ignore the truth. She privately confided in him one day, urging him to think about how his actions might have affected the community. "James," she said, "we can't ignore what's happening. People are starting to see the truth, and we have to face it too." Meanwhile, Officer Ben Harrison, a colleague who had been one of Harper's closest allies, was hesitant to take a side. He warned Harper about Marcus's influence in the community. "The man's got pull," Ben cautioned. "He's not going to let this go, and neither is the rest of the city. You need to think carefully about how you handle this." The divide within the precinct was growing, and with every passing day, it seemed less like a matter of professional conduct and more like a fight for personal redemption. As the days went on, Harper found himself sinking deeper into a whirlwind of emotions. His once strong belief in the justice system, the very foundation of his identity as a police officer, was beginning to unravel. His life had always been built around a sense of certainty that the law was always right, that his role was to enforce it, and that his actions, no matter how harsh, were justified by the righteousness of his duty. But now, with the weight of public opinion on his shoulders and the scrutiny of his every move, those beliefs felt fragile. He had always been quick to dismiss complaints about racial bias, convinced that those who pointed fingers were just trying to undermine the system. But the constant stream of news reports, protests, and accusations made him question whether he had been wrong all along. Was the system really fair? Was he, in fact, a part of the problem? Every time he heard Marcus's name or saw the video again, a knot tightened in his stomach. The defiance in Marcus's eyes haunted him, an unspoken challenge that gnawed at his conscience. In the quiet moments at home, Harper found himself replaying the traffic stop in his mind. The way Marcus had held his ground, the way he had maintained his dignity in the face of Harper's aggression. He had never considered that Marcus might have been more than just a troublemaker. He had only seen a black man to be subdued. Now, Harper was forced to confront the possibility that his assumptions had been dangerously flawed. His frustration grew as he grappled with the public outrage, knowing deep down that there was some truth to it. He had been harsh, unjust, and perhaps unknowingly, a part of the very system that had oppressed people like Marcus for years. But admitting that he had wronged Marcus, admitting that he had been a part of the problem, was a bitter pill to swallow. The anger within him burned fiercely. How could he be wrong? How could he have misjudged everything he had believed in for so long? At the same time, there was a growing sense of guilt, a realization that his actions might have harmed a man who, in hindsight, had been trying to make the world a better place. But guilt was complicated, too, because it felt like a weakness, one Harper had been taught to avoid at all costs. He had to protect his pride, protect his reputation. Yet, as the days dragged on, it became harder to ignore the gnawing sense that he needed to do something to fix the damage he had caused. Everywhere he went, he was confronted by the growing divide. Friends and colleagues either stood by him or began to distance themselves. The precinct had become a battleground, with Harper's actions now the epicenter of a larger conversation about race, power, and accountability in law enforcement. His internal struggle was intensifying, but he couldn't see a way out. One evening, as Harper sat in his office, he began to do something he had never done before. He started researching Marcus. He found articles, interviews, and news reports detailing Marcus's work in the community, his political ambitions, and his growing influence. What struck Harper most was the respect Marcus had earned, not just from his community, but from people across the city. He wasn't just another angry activist. He was a man who was fighting for something real, something tangible. Harper knew the stakes were rising, and as he read more about Marcus's plans, a new realization started to form in his mind. Marcus wasn't just an opponent. He was a symbol of everything Harper had been too blind to see. A symbol of the change that was coming, whether Harper was ready for it or not. But could he redeem himself? Could he reconcile his actions? Or would he continue to stand by his pride and let everything crumble? The tension inside Harper was building, and he could feel the weight of his decision hanging over him. The turning point was coming, and soon he would have to choose whether to confront the man he had wronged or ignore the consequences of his actions. The appointment of Marcus Wright as the new police chief shook Harper to his core. Marcus, the same man he had targeted with his racial prejudice during that fateful traffic stop, now sat at the helm of the department. The news spread quickly through the precinct, and Harper's initial reaction was disbelief. He had been so certain that his standing in the department was secure. After all, he had been with the force for years. Marcus's political rise had been swift, but to become the chief of police? Harper hadn't even considered that possibility. The implications of Marcus's promotion hit Harper like a blow to the gut. He couldn't avoid the realization that everything he had stood for, everything he thought he understood about power and authority, was now upended. How could a man like Marcus, someone he had once treated with such disdain, rise to this position? Wasn't law enforcement supposed to be a bastion of order and authority? And didn't that authority belong to people like him, people who had earned their place in the system? Harper's mind raced, replaying every moment of the past few months. How had he missed the signs? How had he failed to see Marcus for who he truly was, an intelligent, capable leader with the potential to change the very system Harper had spent his life serving? The world he thought he knew was unraveling before his eyes. The once powerful structure that had kept him in control now felt fragile, and the uncomfortable truth began to settle in. Marcus had not only proved him wrong in that moment of confrontation during the traffic stop, but he was also about to show Harper that his narrow view of the world, his ingrained biases, were utterly insufficient. In the days following the announcement, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that he was out of place, like a relic of an outdated era. He had always seen himself as part of a system that upheld justice, but now he was facing a stark contrast to that system, an embodiment of the change he had refused to acknowledge. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he could no longer ignore Marcus's rise. It was a direct challenge to his worldview, to everything he thought he had been right about. Marcus wasn't just a new chief. He was a mirror reflecting everything Harper had overlooked about race, power, and justice. The twist came unexpectedly. Marcus, now police chief, called Harper into his office for a meeting. Harper walked in with a mix of dread and resignation. He had no idea what to expect, but part of him was bracing for the worst. Surely, Marcus would want retribution. After all, Harper had humiliated him in front of the community. He had doubted Marcus's integrity and belittled him in ways that now seemed unforgivable. But Marcus surprised him. The anger Harper expected wasn't there. Instead, there was calm authority in Marcus's eyes. "Take a seat, Officer Harper," he said, his tone measured but not unkind. The space between them felt charged with the history of their encounter, but Marcus's demeanor was different. He wasn't looking to settle scores. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even seeking an apology, at least not in the way Harper had expected. What Marcus wanted was something far more difficult for Harper to grasp: reconciliation. "I didn't come here to punish you," Marcus began, his voice steady. "I came here to give you a chance, to show you that things can change, and that you can be a part of that change." Harper blinked, stunned by the words. He had assumed that Marcus, having risen to this position of power, would want to exert control over him, to make Harper feel the full weight of his past mistakes. But instead, Marcus was offering him something Harper never thought possible: a chance at redemption. Harper's mind spun. This wasn't the confrontation he had expected. Instead of retribution, Marcus was offering him the chance to do better, to make amends for the injustice he had caused. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and Harper was left reeling from the realization that he was now the one who had to prove himself worthy of respect. Marcus wasn't out for revenge. He was simply out to be the change that Harper had failed to see. And in that moment, Harper understood that Marcus's position as chief wasn't just a symbol of power. It was a challenge to everything Harper had ever believed. A challenge to change. A challenge to confront his own biases. And it was now up to Harper to decide if he was willing to accept that challenge. Harper sat there, stunned, as the weight of Marcus's words settled in. His mind raced as guilt and shame began to flood him. For the first time in his life, he truly understood the extent of his own ignorance. It wasn't just the incident at the traffic stop, it was everything. His entire life, he had been blind to the struggles of others, especially those from marginalized communities. He had clung to his own version of reality, one where people like Marcus were others, people to be dealt with, rather than understood. The realization struck Harper with overwhelming force. His actions, his biases, had been a direct part of the system that oppressed Marcus and others like him. His arrogance had clouded his ability to see the humanity in the people he interacted with, particularly black men and women. In his mind, they had always been the other, someone to be controlled, subdued, or treated with suspicion. He had failed to recognize that they were human beings with dreams, struggles, and lives that mattered just as much as his own. Sitting across from Marcus, Harper could feel the rawness of his own emotions rising up. He had spent so long justifying his actions, telling himself that he was doing his duty, that his behavior was justified. But now facing Marcus, he understood that he had been wrong. And the shame that filled him wasn't just for the way he had treated Marcus. It was for the way he had viewed an entire group of people through the lens of his own biases. In that moment, Harper knew that he could no longer hide from the truth. He had a choice. He could continue living in denial, clinging to his old beliefs, or he could embrace the possibility of change. The internal battle was intense. His pride screamed for him to defend his actions, to dismiss Marcus's offer as a gesture of weakness. But his heart, raw and exposed, knew that this was a moment of reckoning. The guilt, the shame, and the realization of the damage he had caused were overwhelming. Harper felt a knot in his stomach, a deep sense of responsibility for the harm he had done. He wanted to apologize to Marcus, to take back the pain he had inflicted. But he knew that words alone couldn't undo the damage. If he truly wanted to change, he had to prove it through his actions. It was here, in this confrontation, that Harper finally began to see himself clearly. The man he had become was not one he could be proud of. The road to redemption would not be easy. But in this moment, with Marcus offering him a chance at change, Harper understood the true cost of his mistakes and the path that lay ahead. Harper's journey of redemption began with a series of small, intentional steps. He knew he had to confront his past actions directly, but he also understood that simply apologizing wasn't enough to undo the damage he had caused. The first significant move he made was to enroll in sensitivity training, where he learned about systemic racism, privilege, and the impact of bias policing. At first, it was uncomfortable for him. He didn't want to admit that he was part of the problem. But the more he listened to the voices of those who had been marginalized, the more he realized just how blind he had been to the world around him. Harper also began working closely with Marcus on community outreach initiatives. Marcus's role as police chief allowed him to spearhead programs aimed at building trust between the police and the black community. Harper's involvement in these efforts was not just a matter of duty, but a personal mission. He wanted to rebuild the trust that he had so carelessly broken. He reached out to local leaders, listened to their stories, and started doing the hard work of confronting the prejudices that had shaped his worldview for so long. In his personal life, Harper began taking steps to undo the damage he had caused. He reached out to the families who had been affected by his actions, apologizing where he could. He joined community meetings, worked alongside activists, and allowed himself to be challenged by those who had been fighting for justice long before he had ever questioned his own biases. Slowly, Harper began to see that healing was not just about words. It was about consistent action, accountability, and vulnerability. His transformation was slow, but it was genuine. Over time, Harper's mindset shifted. He started recognizing his flaws, and rather than feeling defensive, he embraced the opportunity to grow. He had begun the journey with guilt and shame, but now he was learning that those emotions didn't need to define him. The real transformation lay in taking action, learning, unlearning, and working to be better each day. One of the most significant changes in Harper's behavior was his growing relationship with Marcus. What had started as a professional connection rooted in tension and conflict now blossomed into mutual respect. Marcus, in turn, had always been willing to extend a hand to Harper, but only after Harper proved that he was committed to doing the work. Over time, Harper learned to listen without judgment, to engage in conversations with empathy, and to view Marcus not just as a leader, but as a mentor. Through these interactions, Harper's perspective broadened. He began to see the world not just from the lens of his badge, but through the eyes of those he had once marginalized. The relationships he built with community leaders were transformative. He began to understand the importance of equity, justice, and the complex ways that history and power intersected in shaping people's lives. Harper became less rigid in his thinking and more open-minded, realizing that there were many ways to serve justice, and it didn't have to involve upholding the same flawed systems he had believed in before. As Harper reflected on his growth, he couldn't help but acknowledge the stark contrast between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. He had spent years in a world where power, control, and authority defined his sense of self. But through his work with Marcus, through the painful but necessary journey of self-reflection, Harper realized that true power didn't lie in the enforcement of rules or the suppression of others. It lay in empathy, humility, and a commitment to doing what was right, even when it was difficult. He had learned that justice wasn't about winning or proving a point. It was about recognizing the humanity in every person, listening to their experiences, and striving to create a system where all people were treated fairly. Harper understood now that his role in law enforcement was not just about upholding laws, but about helping to build a world where those laws served everyone equally. The guilt and shame that once clouded his mind were now replaced with a quiet sense of pride, not the kind born from superiority, but from the knowledge that he had made amends, that he was doing the hard work to change, and that he was no longer the man he once was. In the final scene, Harper and Marcus stood side by side, working on a community project to improve relations between the police and the Black community. The project was one of many designed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they were meant to serve. Together, they had organized town hall meetings, hosted workshops on police accountability, and developed mentorship programs for young people in marginalized communities. As they surveyed the progress of the project, Harper couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The work they had done together was symbolic of their shared vision, a vision of a future where justice was not just a word, but a lived experience for everyone. It was a future where the police force was not seen as an oppressive authority, but as a partner in creating safer, more equitable communities. For Harper, this moment was the culmination of a long and difficult journey, a journey of growth, redemption, and reconciliation. And as he looked at Marcus, the man he had once so deeply underestimated, he knew that this was only the beginning. The work wasn't over, but they were on the right path, a path of mutual respect, understanding, and the promise of a better, more inclusive future. Change is never easy, but it's always worth it. Let us know in the comments what you think about this story of transformation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of redemption and growth.